What's the scariest video game you've ever played? Close your eyes, sit back and really try to relive that horror. Maybe you're running from a horde of zombies. Maybe you're hiding from a supernatural apparition. Perhaps you're trying to escape an abandoned hospital, or you're fleeing from religious cultists. Chase scenes, hiding in cupboards, walking simulators with annoying teeth-grinding sound effects, Lovecraftian epics, and alien isolation. Truly, I don't get why it's near the top of so many lists of best, scariest horror games. I mean, it's tense, but it's so f***ing repetitive. Anyway, open your eyes. If you've played one or two horror games in your time, these examples, these tropes, will seem fairly familiar. You could argue that they perfectly encapsulate what we would typically broadly categorise as the horror genre of gaming, right? Games designed with your fear in mind. So you might be surprised to learn that none of these are at the top of my personal list. The scariest game I've ever played isn't even classed as a horror game. On Steam, you can find it under Adventure Games, and rather than a blood-curdling, spine-tingling experience, the New York Times described it as the greatest video game love story ever told. Hardly the stuff of horror, right? Yet to this day, the scariest game I've ever played is Gone Home, and I've played all of these. Now, you might be sat there thinking, how is this possible? How can you be scared by a game that's not even classed as a horror game? It doesn't even feature an alien that you have to hide from over and over and over again. Gone Home isn't a slasher, supernatural, teeth-grinding experience, so how is it the scariest game I've ever played? The answer to that question lies in a literary technique that's over 200 years old. And to explore what Gone Home and plenty of other horror media owes to this technique, we're first going to journey back in time to look at its origins in English literature, discover more about the writer who popularised it, and then jump into some juicy comparisons. And, please beware, there is a spoiler warning in effect, so make sure you play the game first. It's literally a 2-hour-long walking simulator, so you have no excuses. By the way, if you're new to this channel, I'm Dr. Rosie Whitcomb, this is Mouse, who savaged me earlier today, and we make videos on literature, history, and how the written word shapes our lives today. So, if that's your jam, don't forget to like and subscribe. In Gone Home, you play as a young woman, Katie, who returns to her family home in the dead of night after travelling abroad to find it empty. You've never actually been to this house before. You learn that your parents, Janice and Terry, and your younger sister, Samantha, moved here while you were off travelling. You begin on the front porch, and you find a note on the door written by your sister that says, please don't go digging around trying to find out where I am. So naturally, you spend the next 2 hours digging around trying to find out where she is. As you walk around your empty house, you learn, through a series of notes and clues, that your sister has fallen in love with her female friend, Lonnie, and the two of them have eloped. That's essentially the premise. You, as the player, are set up to work out why the house is empty. But, I hear you asking, what about that is scary? Well, if you're a homophobe, perhaps the idea of two women eloping is enough to send shivers down your spine, and if that's the case, you're welcome to vacate this channel now. What's scary about Gone Home is the clever way the game is framed. Essentially, the game tricks you into thinking it's scary, when nothing horror-esque is actually happening. It's not like your family have been abducted, there's no demonic ghostly presence or bloody clues, though your brain is led to consider all these potentialities. You get scared because you feel like you should. You're alone in the house. It's dark outside, it's raining. You're constantly looking for lamps to turn on. Your sister's note is cryptic and unnerving. And you end up reading her diaries and stuff, and there's content in them about a seance and a spirit that haunts the house. You're unnerved as the lights flicker and the thunder rumbles overhead. Features of the house, like the giant staircase in the hall area, are imposing. You find notes that refer to your new, yet-to-be-explored home as the Psycho House, a reference to your great-uncle Oscar, who used to live there and who you learn had mental health problems, even though, the game is set in the 90s and mental health problems haven't been invented yet. But you don't learn any of that till later on. You're in a state of dread, wondering what lurks behind the hidden panels in the walls and jumping when the floorboards creak. Even though all this is circumstantial, your rational brain shuts down. You've played horror games before, and you know how this usually pans out. But you needn't fear. Gone Home isn't a horror game, in the traditional sense at least. You don't get any of this, or even this. Gone Home terrifies you purely through the power of suggestion. The game plays on your capacity to terrify yourself, and you do a very good job of this. There's a rational and logical explanation for the chilling setting, the seance-y notes, the empty house. Everything scary is eventually explained away with reason. To do this, the game relies on what we might call the explained supernatural, and this is a phenomenon that dates back more than 200 years to a writer named Anne Radcliffe. Now, if you've watched my video series on the Gothic, you'll know all about Radcliffe, mother of Gothic literature, Shakespeare of romance writers. You'll remember that, in part, we owe all the spooky, scary media we enjoy today to her excellently terrifying novels. And you might even remember that I touched briefly on Radcliffe's explained supernatural. Simply put, the explained supernatural is the rational demystification of scary, unsettling, and often supernatural events with a reasonable, logical means of clarification. Classic Scooby-Doo vibes, right? Scary ghost that haunts Old Mill is revealed by the end of the episode to be a man wearing a sheet. Radcliffe popularised this, and her technique was rather unique. Many other Gothic writers of the 1790s incorporated real ghosts and spirits into their writing without logically explaining them away at the end. So, for example, in Radcliffe's most famous novel, The Mysteries of Udolpho, there's this incident fairly early on where our heroine, Emily, who's being held against her will at the Gothic castle of Udolpho by the evil Montoni, peers behind a curtain and sees something so horrible she's frightened out of her wits and can never return to the room in which she found it. We, as readers, don't know what she's seen, but we're led to imagine the worst. A blood-stained dagger? A ghost? A freshly murdered body? We just don't know. But our imaginations run wild with grave speculation. By the end of the novel, however, we finally receive an explanation that allays our fears. It may be remembered that, in a chamber of Udolpho, hung a black veil, whose singular situation had excited Emily's curiosity, and which afterwards disclosed an object that had overwhelmed her with horror, for on lifting it, there appeared, instead of the picture she had expected within a recess of the wall, a human figure of ghastly paleness. Emily, it may be recollected, had, after the first glance, let the veil drop, and her terror had prevented her from ever after provoking a renewal of such suffering as she had then experienced. Had she dared to look again, her delusion and her fears would have vanished together, and she would have perceived that the figure before her was not human, but formed of wax. Radcliffe explains that this waxen figure of a corpse is a sort of memento mori, to remind the viewer of their mortality. Still creepy, but not a half-decayed, worm-eaten corpse. The uncertainty, and thus the terror, has been dissipated through explanation. And we get the same setup in Gone Home. Like when you're exploring the bathroom, and you've just read your sister's notes about ghost hunting, and then you see blood spattered over the bath! You could turn and run and faint like Emily does, overcome by what she's seen behind the veil, which is exacerbated by the scary castle setting. Or you could look more closely, put aside your fears that are exacerbated by the spooky house setting, and realise that it's actually only red hair dye. And if you pick up the dye, it activates one of Sam's voiceovers in which she talks about the intimacy involved in touching Lonnie's hair while she dyed it for her. What feels like terror dissolves into the flickerings of romance. You go from, "Oh, they died!" to, "Oh, they died." But those examples aren't really supernatural. And we're talking about the explained supernatural, right? A murdered body and blood in the bathtub don't defy logic. So let's turn to another example from The Mysteries of Udolpho, where nighttime ghostly apparitions do play a part in the formation of a hair-raising scene. So, a bit of background. Later on in the novel, Emily moves into a chateau and learns from the housekeeper, Dorothy, that one of the chambers is reportedly haunted. Dorothy's late mistress died in the bed in that very chamber under suspicious circumstances. Now, there's quite a lot of preamble before Emily and Dorothy decide, in the dead of night, to visit these haunted chambers, and Radcliffe doesn't hold any punches when it comes to setting the spooky scene, opening the chapter with this from A Midsummer Night's Dream. "Now it is the time of night, that the graves all gaping wide, every one lets forth his sprite in the churchway path to glide." There's a lot of tension building as they tentatively explore the chamber before they see a ghost! As Emily gazed within the curtains, the pall moved again, and, in the next moment, the apparition of a human countenance rose above it. They leave the chamber, screaming in terror. Now, Emily, ever sensible, tries her best to rationalise the situation, but exhausts every possibility, and she's left to draw the only remaining conclusion that the ghastly countenance she had seen was nothing human, but some dreadful apparition. But, true to form, later on in the novel, Radcliffe explains away this supernatural visitation. It's revealed that there's a secret passage concealed behind the arras near the bed, used by a group of banditti to travel via a long subterranean passage from their hideout into the chateau. Hence the spooky noises and the so-called apparitions. Now, if you're thinking that scenario seems a tad far-fetched, you wouldn't be alone. I mean, how the householders didn't realise there was a secret passage concealed in the chamber is odd, to say the least, but still, it's a perfect example of the explained supernatural. The literal alteration of a seemingly ghostly visitation demystified by logical means. And these are only two examples of the explained supernatural in a novel and in an oeuvre of work that contains many. You can see how Radcliffe always works out an explanation for her spooky goings-on, apart from actually in her last novel, in which she did include a real ghost. So, in nearly all her writing then, rather than frightening by way of demons and spirits, Radcliffe relies in large part on her frightening settings, the winding and unknown territory of the castle, the abandoned and purportedly haunted chambers, and the uncertain fate of her poor heroine, to work her reader up into a state of terror. And we get the same framing in Gone Home. Things that you easily attribute to a haunted house are rationalised. The lights flickering, for example, when you first enter the house, are explained when you find this note, an electrical inspection form that tells you the old house contains dodgy wiring. There are other examples too, like this note, evidently written by your sister and Lonnie while they performed a séance, but then you also find your sister's sighting journal that says things like, "A faint voice coming from the bottom of the stairs. I said hello, did not investigate. Probably was the furnace." Or, "I saw a tall shadow in the upstairs hallway, but I wasn't wearing my glasses." The practice of suggesting and then explaining away the supernatural is peppered throughout the game. And by the way, if you enjoy videos like this that trace the origins of contemporary literature and media back to their centuries-old roots, give this a like so we know to make more. Now, Radcliffe was an incredibly popular and successful author in her own day, but this isn't to suggest her use of the explained supernatural was a universally beloved trait. To some, her deliberate choice not to include actual ghosts was a sign of her genius. Without introducing into her narrative anything really supernatural, Mrs. Radcliffe has contrived to produce as powerful an effect as if the invisible world had been obedient to her magic spell. But others argued that it's a technique that doesn't really work long term, because once you're wise to it, you're wise to it. Her mode of accounting in a natural manner for supernatural appearances, now the secret has gotten vent, lessens the effect, and the interest of the story is interrupted by the reader's attention to guard against the delusions of the imagination. For me personally, I don't mind the explained supernatural as Radcliffe uses it. I still find her books scary whether I'm anticipating a ghost or a group of bandits. And I think it's interesting that she was such a champion of this mode, suggesting perhaps that the use of the real supernatural in fiction repelled her somewhat. But what do you think? Ghosts or bloodthirsty bandits? What's scarier? Let me know in the comments below. Regardless, Radcliffe's explained supernatural certainly made her stand out from the crowd in her day and solidified her stellar reputation, and its influence has clearly persisted into the 21st century. Gone Home puts you through your terrified paces. You cautiously walk down the dark hallway. You hear a noise in the next room. Your heart starts to race, only to find that the TV's been left on. You read your sister's notes about your great-uncle Oscar who haunts the house and the séance that she and Lonnie held, and you're wary every time you turn a corner. But every corner you turn is free from supernatural apparitions. You walk down the basement stairs in complete darkness, failing to find the light switch with your eyes closed, holding the controller at arm's length, screaming. But once you're down there, you realise your fear is entirely unfounded. It's a basement of no particular note, and you carry on rooting around in boxes and drawers to find more clues. When you arrive at the end of the game, attic key in hand, you're prepared for that inevitable jump scare. You wonder, will it be Oscar's ghost? Will it be his skeleton? Has your sister accidentally welcomed some evil spirit into the house via a séance that's waiting for you as you slowly climb the ladder? Worse still, you've noticed that a lot of your sister's notes are distressed and anxious. Could she be up there? Could she be dead? Your fear peaks at this moment as you enter the attic, bracing yourself for the worst. But what you find is something else entirely. It's your sister's last note that finally explains to you why the house is empty, that explains how and why she has left the family home. What this game does so expertly is shift gear right at the very end. You think one mystery is about to be demystified, the one you've effectively made up in your terrified little head, but what you find out is something different altogether. While your parents are away at couples counselling, which explains their absence, Samantha decides to elope with Lonnie, who was on her way to begin service as a cadet, but instead gets off the bus mid-journey and calls Samantha to tell her she wants to be with her instead. Having gone home, You spend your time learning about your younger sister and her struggles, watching her transform and grow and make a decision to be herself and be with the person she wants to be with, despite the upset she knows it will cause her parents. What you expect to be a terrifying horror twist turns out to be a sensitively told queer coming-of-age story. And you could argue that this is the real horror. Growing up into a family that doesn't accept your sexuality and choices can be a horrific thing to have to go through. And I guess it's more common an experience than living in a haunted house. It's this illusory storytelling, this ability to make you feel you're engaged in one narrative when actually something completely different is going on behind the scenes, that Gone Home owes to Radcliffe and her explained supernatural. Anne Radcliffe was a literary trailblazer, and her use of the explained supernatural is just one way her influence can be felt in literature, film, and games today. Learn more about the Gothic, Anne Radcliffe, and the origins of our love of horror by clicking here next.